Hello, I'm Jake Stone.
I'm Jesse Owens.
And we welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptists, about Baptists, and for Baptists, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and even a Lutheran. I'm a Calvinistic Baptist, and Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. And in the 17th and 18th centuries, we would have been known as a General Baptist and a Particular Baptist. And so we brought those together in a fun way to form Generally Particular. And we're excited to do another one of our episodes today that we like to call Baptist Bios. And today we're going to be talking about Dan Taylor. And we're very pleased to have David Lytle with us on the show. David, thanks for entering into the Generally Particular. I almost want to do my old Bill O'Reilly, the no spin zone. So,
oh man,
thanks for having me in the no spin zone.
Yeah, so we like to not have too much spin here.
Yeah. So, David, tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Hey, I'm David Lytle, and a long time ago, like 20 years ago, I went to Welch College. So I grew up in the Free Will Baptist tradition. I have spent some time overseas doing missions work, and I currently teach in California at a school out in Riverside, California. So that's near where my wife's from, and I am currently a PhD student at Gateway Seminary, studying with Dr. Lytle, trying to do stuff in Baptist history and trying to learn what I can about General Baptist. I teach history and Bible at my school.
Nice. We had some interaction with Dr. Lytle at ETS this year. In fact, we talked about his book on one of our previous episodes. So,
Andrew Fuller, yeah.
Yeah, Andrew Fuller in the search for a faith worthy of all acceptation. So, yeah.
I probably shouldn't admit on air that I haven't read it yet. But
yeah, well, maybe he doesn't listen. I don't know.
I have read the book, so I get a thumbs up.
Unless he's going to give you a copy, it's pretty expensive. So there you go.
He did not give me a copy.
So we're talking today about Dan Taylor, which brings up we Jesse and I have touched on it before about the way that he and I connected, which was that Jesse wrote an article that was in the Founders Journal that I think the whole journal was dedicated. Was it on Andrew Fuller's controversies or polemics, Jesse?
Yeah. Sorry, I was having some internet connection issues. It was a little bit on polemics and the polemic with between Taylor and Fuller, which David addresses a little bit in his article. Yeah, so that came out of a class with Tom Nettles on Andrew Fuller. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Jesse wrote in such a great way that I thought he was on my side of the issues, and disappointed to learn that he wasn't afterwards. But that's the beginning of our friendship. So it includes Andrew Fuller and Dan Taylor. So let's talk about, first of all, David, who is Dan Taylor? I think there might be a lot of our listeners who are not familiar with him at all. So if you were kind of going to give a big picture, who is this General Baptist theologian?
Yeah, I think Dan Taylor is really, I think, far more significant than we give him credit for. I would say, in short, I think he did more than anyone to help the General Baptist stay away or move out of or save them from heterodoxy. So this is the 18th century, and there was a lot of pretty heretical teaching on things like the Trinity and the nature of Christ, and Taylor sort of leads a reform and a revival movement within those ranks. And so a little biography of him. I just find this fascinating. He's a super working class kind of person. He was a coal miner when he was 5 years old. His father was a coal miner, and he started working at 5. But he also sort of was naturally gifted intellectually and learned how to read, and as a very young man as well. He and his brother would travel sometimes walk 20 miles or so to hear John Wesley preach, Charles Wesley or George Whitefield. He became a Methodist, and so was converted really in the kind of the Methodist revival movement. And he then kind of comes to a parting of ways. I find it a little bit ironic. He sees Wesley, he understands John Wesley, to be sort of a too much of a dictator of that movement. But later on, I'm not saying he was a dictator, but he was sort of the leader of what is called the New Connection of the General Baptist. And so he really did a lot of what Wesley did for the Methodist and the General Baptist movement. But he disagrees on Wesley primarily on baptism, as well as his views on sanctification. And so, Wesley, as you probably know, is an infant Baptist, and Taylor did not find that in Scripture. So he wanted to join he wanted to be baptized in a Baptist church, and so he initially went to a particular Baptist church. They didn't want him because he was too Arminian for them, and so he joins in with a General Baptist congregation. Is ordained by a guy named Gilbert Boyce, who was a pretty strong leader of General Baptist at the time. And he joins, he jumps in with them. He becomes a pastor. I think primarily he's a pastor more than a theologian, but he becomes a pastor with the General Baptist. And he's frustrated that there's so many within their ranks that are very, they're either Socinian or Unitarian, or maybe some Universalists as well, and all these things he has huge problems with theologically. I think Dan Taylor, more than anything, is an evangelical. He is a George Whitefield, John Wesley kind of guy, and so he's frustrated that his denomination is allowing for these false teachings to occur, and so he really leads that renewal movement, the New Connection. He forms kind of other groups into it, and they join together. So some General Baptists join him, some other groups that hadn't been General Baptist but became General Baptist. And really, this was the General Baptist movement that eventually joins in with the Baptist Union, because most of the other General Baptists just die out. They don't stay around, which is fortunately what happens when you don't believe in. Not always, but normally your numbers decline when you stop believing in the gospel and stop believing in the divinity of Christ. It's not really good for attendance.
There's no life. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for that introduction, David. I wanted to get some input from you on. You mentioned some influences on Dan Taylor, and you recently had an article it's in the most recent Hanover Review on Taylor's theology of grace. But in there, you talk a lot about some theological influences, mostly folks who are outside of the Baptist circle. So maybe tell us a little bit more about some of those influences. You mentioned the Wesleys, you mentioned the writings of Doddridge, Whitefield. I think you also mentioned Puritans, Edwards. But talk a little bit about those. And then are there some Baptist influences on Taylor that you've run across?
Let me start with the Baptist influence. That I liked the question. It's something, and I don't want to pretend to be the world's expert on Dan Taylor. There's probably not very many people. I would say Richard Pollard's book on Dan Taylor is the best source to go to. He's sort of it's relatively recent, and it's a very well done book. There's not a lot else out there that's really on him and his theology. So I'm maybe one of the 5 people that know very much about Dan Taylor, but I know far less than someone like Pollard does. But as far as his influence, he really did. He was influenced by and had good relationships with just the other particular Baptists that were around him, as well as the General Baptist. So I was actually, in looking at this last night, I went and I was doing a little more digging around in his memoirs and things like that. So I'm going to kind of list some of his relationships with particular Baptists, and I find this fascinating. So he was John Sutcliffe's Latin tutor. And so Sutcliffe would later pastor William Carey and help train him. He pastored very close to John Fawcett Sr., who is a particular Baptist pastor in Yorkshire. So they both pastored in Yorkshire. And the two of them would meet regularly and discuss philosophy and theology. And so really, although they came to different views, or they have different views on the atonement and on, soteriology, they were, when it came to things like the doctrine of the divinity of Christ and these things like the works of Joseph Priestley, which was kind of Unitarian, these guys would read them, discuss, dissect them, and combat them. They both combated them. And so these guys were kind of in that together, and just really close friends. So they had their own generally particular thing going on is what was happening. He was really good friends with Abraham Booth, and I just read, so I didn't notice that until last night, but I was reading about him being just very upset and kind of distraught when Abraham Booth passed away. He preached the funeral of a particular Baptist, Samuel Stinnett, who was the grandson of Benjamin Stinnett, a 17th century General Baptist. And then so he debates significantly with Andrew Fuller, and they have kind of this exchange in writing. They're both using, it's after gospel worthy of all acceptation. Taylor, for the most part, loves it, says, but you can't limit the atonement to the only elect. So he's believes in general atonement, and so he does want to debate Fuller on that point, or he writes about it, publishes about it, and they kind of go back and forth for a few years doing that. But even afterwards, Fuller comes and preaches at his church. Later on, Taylor moves to London, and so Fuller comes, preaches there for him. And so he wasn't hostile with a particular Baptist by any means. I see a lot more of that influence than him really drawing on previous Baptists, even in the General Baptist tradition. He's interesting because he's very much influenced by, I think, the evangelicalism of his day and the evangelical particular Baptist of his day, more so than drawing on a previous, older tradition. And then maybe that's a weakness, but there's a lot of richness there in his own, with Wesley Brothers, or with Whitefield, or with Fuller and the people that he's interacting with.
Yeah. Oh, I think that makes a lot of sense. Actually, I noticed that in one of your footnotes about him inviting Fuller to preach, and either I didn't know that or I had forgotten that. So you said Fuller actually did come and preach.
I believe so. I mean, I hope I'm not wrong. I found that in something that Haken had published.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that is correct. I mean,
okay.
Fortunately, this isn't being printed anywhere. Oh no, just kidding.
No, that's very interesting. So tell us a little bit more about some of the evangelical influences on Taylor. So again, in your essay in Hanover Review, Doddridge features pretty prominently, and then the Wesleys as well. So tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, so I kind of highlighted Doddridge influence in that essay, mostly because, and like I said, Richard Pollard does a great work, or does a good job in really explaining Taylor's theology. But one thing I didn't really notice that Pollard does is really talk about the influence of Doddridge. He does a little bit, but as I read Taylor and I read his memoirs, he talks about Doddridge constantly. And I realized that, like, oh, this guy's favorite author is Philip Doddridge. And so it made me think, like, well, so who's Philip Doddridge? And I'm no expert on Doddridge, but Doddridge sort of had this kind of like Taylor, a pretty big tent approach to evangelicalism. He's not wanting to be, and you can definitely see problems with this, but he's not confessional. or he wants to be pretty minimalistic when it comes to these are the things that we believe. So he's going to be orthodox when it comes to the Trinity and certain things, but he doesn't want to split hairs over Calvinism, Arminianism, and those sorts of things. So Doddridge is kind of a early evangelical. His biggest most influential book is the Rise and Progress of Religion and the Soul of Man, I think is the title. But it's very much this internal piety, that Doddridge is really promoting, and I think that really does impact Taylor. But I would say about Doddridge is, Doddridge does come from a more Calvinistic background, and so he really does understand that while he doesn't want to get into the Doddridge doesn't want to really talk about irresistible grace or unconditional election. He does want to make sure that it's clear that if anyone is going to be changed, the Spirit has to work inside of them, and so the operation of the Spirit must be what happens and what changes a person. And so Taylor's able to completely accept that, even though he believes that Christ died for all. He believes in that grace is resistible. He believes in, he's an Arminian in pretty much every way. But he's going to say that he's going to be emphasize, and I think Jacob Arminius would do this as well. He's going to emphasize that the Spirit must move in a person for them to be able to have faith. And so you can call this prevenient grace, and so it's something that he really, I think. Oh, what I kind of highlight in the essay is Doddridge really helped him come to this, and I think interacting with Fuller, some of Fuller's arguments were so strong that he really did develop and write a whole section. He added a chapter in a book that, kind of theological introduction book that he wrote. He added a whole section really on the work of the Spirit leading to salvation. So someone's not saved just because, hey, I choose God, but God is bringing them to himself. And even as an Arminian, Taylor would definitely say that.
I thought that was interesting how you mentioned that it's kind of a two-way street between Fuller and Taylor. So, we might think about some of the changes that occur between the first and second edition of Gospel Worthy through maybe their discussion on the atonement. But you mentioned in the essay that there is an influence of Fuller on Taylor as well. So again, it's kind of going both ways.
Yeah, and I wish I would have had the I don't have resources next to me right here, but if you read Fuller's not biography, his diary, in these exchanges, and he talks about the text that Taylor uses in his debate, how those really kind of won him over, to where Fuller's and at least Peter Morton says that by the end of this whole thing, his account of the atonement is in some ways general. Now, I think there's tons of debate over that, so I don't really want to step into that. I had a Andrew Fuller seminar with Chris Chun and with Chun and with, David Allen is saying one thing. There's a lot of people saying a lot of different things about Fuller's Fuller's account of the atonement. And I'm not really, there's a lot smarter people than me out there that are making their argument for what it is. But I do think that Fuller's theology changed, and I do think he had to account for those passages, like in 1 John that says that Christ died not only for our sins but for the sins of the whole world. Taylor certainly takes that to mean that the atonement is universal in its scope. The work of Christ is for all and only applied to those who have faith. So Fuller doesn't come to the same position as he does. He never is won over completely, but he does sort of alter his view of the atonement and kind of has to nuance it because of the passages that Taylor really brings to that.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was interesting, though, is you say that there's some change in Taylor's views because of the influence of Fuller. So, whereas maybe some things change in Fuller's account of the atonement, or at least the way that he words things between the first and second editions of Gospel Worthy. But there's some change in Taylor, though, from the influence of Fuller, whereas Taylor maybe has a higher view of the influence of the effects of sin on mankind through the exchange that he has with Fuller.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and that is what I try to point out. That, and so I think that's, and one reason I wanted to write about that, and I just even have this conversation is because I really do think what you guys are doing is can be really valuable. And I think if you stay in your little silo, and denominations are good. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but right. But if you stay cut off and you don't have these conversations, then you there may be things that you never thought about before, and arguments you never thought about. But I think for Taylor, he really realized that, hey, in interacting with Fuller and probably with his other, like John Fawcett, and having these interactions, he's realizing, hey, I need a better account of God's work in leading someone to salvation. And I think that's consistent with traditional Arminian doctrine. I think that's consistent with Jacob Arminius. I think it's consistent with people like Thomas Grantham, but I don't think he really had it until he had that dialogue. And so those debates sharpened his theology. I think it made it more biblical, and hopefully that's what happened, I think, on Fuller's side of things. That made his theology a little more biblical.
Well, not that it'll shock anybody, but I don't agree with Peter Morton's analysis on Fuller, but that's not for this episode. You mentioned just a second ago Thomas Grantham, and that's one of the questions I wanted to ask, because we've done an episode on Grantham before. And I think big picture wise, when people think about General Baptist figures, leaders, theologians, at least if someone were to ask me, the first two people that I would say are Thomas Grantham and Dan Taylor. Those would be the first two names that come to mind. What would you say? I know you said that he was not, like, as far as your research and so forth, he's not really citing a lot of previous General Baptists that have come before him. Number one, does that include Grantham? And then number two, what would you say are similarities and differences? Maybe not so much in views, although if there are differences, you would say in the views, but maybe even in kind of just how they do theology.
Okay. No, great question. So Grantham is a wonderful figure from the 17th century that I think anyone who cares about Baptist history should look into. I wish sorry, I'm gonna blame you guys. I only got this question, yesterday, and I'm a busy man, so I couldn't really deep dive into figuring out whether or not Grantham, had a bunch of influence on him. I don't know of any time that he really cites Grantham or talks specifically about the works of Grantham. So that might be out there. Again, there's not just a ton of Dan Taylor research done, so there might be something to it. Someone could certainly do that. But I was trying to think of a connection, and one possible. So I think Taylor would have had to know about Grantham, though, and I say that because Taylor did a lot of the New Connection people came from Lincolnshire, and he was ordained by Gilbert Boyce, who was from Lincolnshire, and Grantham was this towering figure. And Baptist life is pretty regional, but he was from Lincolnshire, and so I think certainly Gilbert Boyce was a sort of Grantham guy, and so I think Taylor's interaction with Boyce would have made him at least aware of Grantham and what he did. So I do think that there's at least some knowledge. I would love to be a fly on the wall of not Grantham. Taylor visited Joseph Priestley. If you guys know who Joseph Priestley is, he was a Unitarian, and also a scientist. I mean, he discovered oxygen, so that was good. He was a great scientist, but a Unitarian nonconformist minister. And Taylor went to his estate in Birmingham, and it was a nice estate, and they drank wine together. So we might probably have to edit that out of the show. But the two of them hung out, and he gave Priestley sort of the history of the Baptist, and talked about Calvinism and Arminianism in Baptist life, and did a little general Baptist history for Priestley. And I would be really curious to know what he talked about. Now, Taylor's nephew, Adam Taylor, writes the history of the General Baptist, and so clearly he knew about Grantham. He writes a lot about him. I say all that to say, or to go back to the question. No, I don't think they knew, or I don't think Taylor knew about Grantham, or he knew about him, but I don't think he really was directly influenced. I think they are pretty different in some ways. I think some general things are the same, but I think something like laying on of hands for the General Baptists of the 17th century, and I think Grantham really led the way on this. The kind of ordinance of laying on of hands of baptized believers was kind of an essential part of the entrance. It was part of the baptism ceremony and part of General Baptist life. And Taylor kind of thinks this is adiaphora. We don't need to squabble over this. He doesn't embrace it. He's not against it. He's it's just Boyce is definitely for it, and so the two of them disagree on that. Boyce is against hymn singing, and Taylor is very much for hymn singing. So you have a little hymn singing controversy in the General Baptist circles. So I do think Taylor is going to go about things differently than Grantham ever did. He's going to come to some different conclusions. Grantham, lastly, is very much influenced by the patristic tradition, and is always trying. Grantham's kind of whole approach to theology is how can I present General Baptist theology as being consistent with the early church and what they believed. And so he's going to find his, we believe this about the Trinity because they believe this, and we believe this because they, so he's constantly citing Augustine and Tertullian and other church fathers, councils, and those sorts of things. Taylor doesn't do that. Dan Taylor is, I think, a weakness in his theology is he's very much a biblicist, from what and not necessarily in a bad way, but hey, it's the plain reading of Scripture. He's not really very interested in, from what I can tell, much of like the tradition of the church, especially the ancient tradition.
I think the comment you made about the regional nature of Baptist life, that's really important and interesting. And I think in the Lincolnshire connection between Taylor, Boyce, and Grantham, I think there probably really is something there. Grantham certainly is a towering figure in that region. And I would say within, a little over half a century, 3/4 of a century of time since Grantham's death, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some awareness. And I really think your point, which this might be worth exploring some more, but the connection with the Baptist historian Adam Taylor, who wrote in the 1800s with Dan Taylor, that's a really fascinating point. So to think about, where is, obviously you have Crosby's history and some others, but to think about Adam Taylor pulling on, exploring the history of the Baptist, specifically even General Baptist, and then the connection with Taylor, that's pretty fascinating. Yeah,
one thing I find interesting is, and again, there might be things out there that I'm just not aware of, but what I've read of Taylor, there's a phrase that he talks about the old General Baptist, or the General Baptist, and he says, in a word, they degraded Jesus Christ and he degraded them. Mm-hmm. So he's talking about how the General Baptists have lost their Orthodox Trinitarianism. And so that's why they're in decline, and he's starting this new Connect movement. And you see this kind of thing where talks about how good they used to be, and then not so much anymore, right? They have all these heretical issues, and so he kind of contrasts the good days and the current terrible situation. But I haven't read very much or really much of anything where he deals very much specific with the 17th century. So he kind of idealizes that this was great back then, but he doesn't really go into very much specifics. But of course, Adam Taylor does. They are related, and so clearly there's got to be some knowledge. And Adam Taylor's drawing on Crosby, but he's doing his own research as well. So there's just probably more to be explored there.
Yeah. How did how was Taylor viewed by his contemporaries? Let's think specifically about General Baptist contemporaries. So earlier you said that he thought that John Wesley was a little bit too much of a dictator, but then Taylor seems to be, certainly with the formation of the New Connection, seems to be very much at least kind of a statesman sort of figure. So how was he viewed by fellow Baptist, fellow New Connection Baptists? Does there seem to be, from the things you've seen, like a general respect and admiration of Taylor's leadership?
I do think so. In every exchange, he comes across as just being this very kind of cordial, this very charitable person. He was like that with his exchanges with Andrew Fuller. And he was okay with disagreeing. He's going to disagree with Fuller. He disagrees with Boyce, who's a General Baptist, about the hymn singing controversy kind of thing. But he does sort of seem to come across as being this very kind of cordial, ironic kind of personality and the way that he dealt with people. So I do think he gained a lot of respect from a lot of people. I do think it's fascinating that, Joseph Priestley invites him and they spend time together. So he's sort of known as he has a lot of respect, I think, from a lot of people. I do think there are, of course, some that are probably on the wrong side of the theological spectrum, that he had some pretty harsh words for, the kind of the Socinians and Universalists that he kind of would denounce. So he could be stern, but I think for the most part he had a lot of respect just for the way he treated people, which I think is very, I think, admirable. There's a lot to admire about him.
And what about after Taylor? How is he viewed by General Baptist in the rest of the 19th century? Is his theology continues to influence subsequent generations, or is he kind of forgotten in some ways?
No, that's a good question. I think Baptist life, once we're getting into the early 20th century, really both America and the UK, but there is a big sense where denominational kind of distinctives are very much fading away, and maybe people like Taylor are to blame because he wasn't gonna be big on those kinds of things. But that also means that you're going to lose your history if you don't. So like when the Baptist Union happens in the late 19th century, so he dies in the early 19th century, so the Baptist Union happens. There's a lot of the differences between like the Calvinist and the Arminian and those kinds of things really do fade away, or downplayed by the Baptist Union. And part of it is because they did move kind of more in an Arminian direction, but they just also kind of moved into more like, hey, we're not going to be hardcore on these theological distinctives. And so people who like him, although he's very ironic and very charitable and is just not going to draw a lot of hard lines, he was going to say, this is what we believe about the atonement, and be pretty direct about that. He probably gets forgotten for those reasons to a certain extent. I mean, not entirely.
I was going to say one thing that kind of strikes me. I was thinking about this because of asking about Taylor's familiarity with Grantham, is like even someone like Benjamin Keach, who was published prolifically, pastored a church that becomes, in many ways, the particular Baptist church in England. And yet, in my reading, for example, I don't ever remember seeing like Andrew Fuller ever quote or cite Benjamin Keach. And it's kind of interesting. It seems in kind of and I don't know if that's because their works were even though they may have published a lot in their lifetime, it's lost because, they are Baptists and dissenters, and that stuff's just not very much available. But it's just interesting to me that even in our own circles, like it seems once at least these men that we would consider giants, that once they're off the stage, nobody really is referencing them or reading them or using them very much.
Yeah, I think it's probably what's available. I mean, it's a great historical question, but how much was available to him, or he had easy access to? He had Pilgrim's Progress, which he read. He had Philip Doddridge, which he read. He would even read John Owen. So he'd read the Puritan literature that was a little more, I think, republished, and these kind of the great books. But then there's the books from your own tradition, which they're not everyone in England's going to be buying the works of Thomas Grantham, and so they get not completely forgotten, but certainly don't have the same accessibility. They're not as accessible.
I think that's a really good point. Part of it has to do with availability and accessibility. So, how many of Keach's writings are continually in publication? So that's a factor, and that might be the primary factor. I also wonder on some of these things if they're not trying to demonstrate some continuity with a kind of a broader Protestantism, or trying to defend their theology as consistent with other Protestant groups, whether we're thinking about the Reformers or other 17th century figures, even kind of down the line. And so they don't cite Baptist sources as much, maybe again, in part for availability, which David mentioned, I think, and that's a great point. And then also maybe trying to demonstrate continuity with the kind of broader tradition. Because in my reading of 17th century sources, and then even kind of more early 18th century sources, I would agree, you don't see Baptists cite other Baptists as much as you would expect. They cite the patristic sources, they cite the Reformers. Sometimes they'll cite other Puritans, but rarely do they cite other Baptists. And so I'm not surprised that that's the case for Taylor as well. And then, like you were saying earlier, that influence kind of with the evangelical revivals, probably a big part of it too, in that there's kind of a broadening of beyond maybe denominational lines, especially in the mid 18th century and forward. So maybe that's a part as well. Can you tell us, David, are there a couple of things? Are there ways in which that Taylor maybe has been misunderstood, or you might say people haven't really thought about him that much, so he can't hardly be misunderstood. So has he been misunderstood? If so, how? And then also thinking about retrieving maybe through reading Taylor, whether we're thinking about theologically or historically, what are some things you would say to current kind of people who are interested in Baptist history or theology? Would you say you should check this out in Taylor?
Oh, great questions. I think for the most part, Taylor has not. There's just not a lot on there. I mean, my initial paper that I wrote, that I had to edit down to the for a journal article, it kind of surveyed everything's written about that I could find that was written about him, and it's just pretty short list. I mean, some Tom Nettles has he's in a chapter, and Haken has a article on him, and those are pretty well done and pretty charitable, although they do disagree with a lot of Taylor's theology. Yeah, but there's just not a lot. There is an article. I'm not going to say the name. I don't want to. I want to try to be like Dan Taylor and be very charitable. But there is an article that's out there that really it's comparing Fuller's theology, and it's really focusing on Fuller's response to Taylor, but Taylor just, I mean, there's no appreciation for anything he's doing at all. And it even sort of basically calls Taylor a heretic, and, at least infers that. And there's no citation of his work. There's nothing, there's no interaction with Taylor whatsoever. And it's just like that kind of thing that's like, well, you should probably at least have, read the guy at some point in time. To be able to do that well. So I think for the most part, he's just unstudied, not necessarily misunderstood. I mean, he's a pretty simple, straightforward guy in a lot of ways. His interpretation of scripture, I think that's something to think about. It's very, I think in some ways, it's very populist. It's, I think maybe this is something, to answer the other part of the question, like, what do we need to look at? I would be curious to kind of delve into more of his interpretation, which is definitely evangelical, maybe in a lot of ways Baptist. I mean, the reason he's so committed to a unlimited atonement is because of his concerns as a preacher. Like, he needs to tell his congregation that Christ died for them, and so it's driven by you could call it populism if you want to. That's a bell. I'm in a school. Although that's a lot softer than the older bells. But he's driven by that sort of concern, and of course he thinks it's biblical. But even at times when he's looking at the scripture, and there's these debates over the sufficiency of the atonement versus the efficiency and those kinds of things, and he basically says, well, first century fishermen wouldn't make those distinctions, and neither does his very working class congregation, and so his approach to scripture is very much, this is the plain sense of it. Now, as in studying theology, I think that can be problematic, and so I feel like there's a delicate line there, or a fine line that can be problematic, because we have to have maybe some metaphysics and some thinking about like Nicaea and how to understand the Trinity and the relationship of the Father to the Son. So sometimes you have to get a little bit more complex than what a very working class British person would say in the 18th century. But I do think there's something to be said for, will it preach? And it's not that the audience is completely going to shape your theology, but is it, at least for Taylor, I mean, if it's unintelligible to a common person, it's not really consistent with the apostles, and so I think that's what he would say.
Jake often asks, "Will it preach?" That's
That's right.
That's the question he often asks. Well, David, thanks so much for joining us to talk about Dan Taylor today. Are you going to be writing a dissertation on Taylor, or are you still trying to figure that out?
Yeah, I don't think so, unless someone can change my mind. I like Taylor. I hope to write another article about him at some point in time. But I've been doing research on Thomas Lamb's congregation of the 17th century early Baptist, and actually kind of getting into the whole, like, are they Baptist identity, kind of before any before the Standard Confession, before things like the 1689 confession, things like that. So like how to define Baptist, or those early folk. So I actually do have an article that came out recently on Lamb and his possible connection with Thomas Helwys and John Merton in that previous tradition. So I think I'm going to go down more of that road. That's what I've done kind of more work on. But it is kind of a fascinating topic, doing that. But Taylor has a lot of good stuff to learn too, or a lot of good stuff to learn from him.
Very good. Yeah, I'm interested to see some of that. I saw the article in Baptist Quarterly, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Well, I guess I saw an earlier edition that you sent me,
Yeah.
but I haven't had a chance to read it in Baptist Quarterly yet, but excited to look at that. Well, again, thank you, David, for joining us today. And as we always remind our listeners, stay Baptist.
Stay Baptist.